Hello, my name is Lauren Stevenson and I'm a curatorial officer for Ironbridge Gorge Museums. I'm here with Ruth Goodman, a social and domestic historian and critically acclaimed author of How to be a Victorian and How to be a Tudor. She's also presented several successful primetime television shows, including Victorian Farm, The Wartime Farm, and most recently, Inside the Factory. We're thrilled that she's been carrying out some research for us into women's history, in particular looking at women who worked in industries in the Gorge. So we've discussed a little bit about what sort of industries these women were working in, but the women themselves, how old were these women? Were they all young unmarried women who were just earning a bit of money for the family, or were there married women involved in this, or even widowed women?
Well, what we're seeing is really two things, both a national pattern and a local pattern, and the two are sort of intermingled in many ways. First of all, in general, right across Britain, the majority of women in paid work, whether it was industry or something else, the majority are young and unmarried. And that is also true in this area. The majority are young and unmarried. But this area, like a few other small areas, in little pockets around the country, there is work for older women, married women. And this is one of those few little pockets where that is true. Within these parishes, particularly within Madeley and Broseley, there is clearly plenty of desire to have married women back into the workplace and to keep those workers right through their lives. Almost every other area, if you were to wander out about in the countryside, you'd find that girls could find plenty of work until they married, and from that was it. You know, even if they wanted a job, they'd have real trouble getting it, and really they'd be reduced to being a charwoman, and there wasn't much else for married women. But round here, it's a bit different. So there is a sizable group of married women who are working particularly in the china and the tile industry, with a few also in the pipe making.
That's really interesting. So how did these women go back to work after they were married and obviously had children? What sort of things were in place that allowed them to do this?
There are a number of suggestions within the information I was able to find, which help to point in those directions. One comes from a really lovely recording that was made way back in the 1970s of an elderly gentleman who was talking about his memories of this region when he was a boy. And he mentioned a system of different starting times. So that one whistle, I can't remember, it was a bell, I think it was a bell, factory bell sounded for the majority of workers, and then 2.5 hours later, a second bell went, and a new cohort came into work. Now, that is very significant. He didn't make the connection because he was remembering it from being a young boy. He talks about them being 3/4 timers and that they would often then carry on and work later into the evening in order to make up the money. But this is a pattern that was particularly suited for married women. It is found in some other areas. I've come across it where there's a lot of commercial laundries who again liked to have married women as workers. And what it gave was a bit of sort of hour flexibility, a flexible working day. You could choose whether you wanted to start at 7 in the morning or 9 in the morning. And if you, obviously you got more money if you started at 7, but the ability to start at 9 meant that a married woman could sort of cope with dealing with the kids, getting them up, getting them dressed, getting them fed, getting them packed off to school, maybe quickly get the dinner on and shove it in the oven and leave it. Just a few bits of domestic control stuff before she went to work. And then by the time she comes home, things are already in motion and she can keep it all ticking along. It was extremely valuable, this sort of leeway for married women. It's one of the things that made it possible for them to return to work with a house full of children and, actually pull it all together. So for a factory to offer that sort of working day is very significant, and not all of them did. This is a factory who wanted married women workers. It wasn't just, it was a nuisance to them. They had to have 2 different sort of systems in place.
Yeah.
They wanted married workers, and they are accommodating some of a married worker's needs.
That's really unusual. So why were these employers so keen to get married women in particular back into the workplace?
I think it's about career progression and skill. A lot of the work that was involved within the China factory in particular takes a long time to learn, and you have to learn it physically, you have to learn it by doing. There's no shortcut method. You just have to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And if you talk to people who work in that industry within living memory, that's exactly how they describe it. You would start, say if you were in the painting workshop, by given, sweeping up jobs and things. And then you're given a very, very simple bit of painting to do. And you do that for ages until you're good at it. And then you added an extra little bit that might so you learn a bit more. And then when you've really got good at that, they might move you onto a full pattern, but one of the simpler ones. And then you get good at that and you spend time. And gradually your repertoire builds. So if at, 22, you leave to go and get married and have a family, you're quite a good worker by then. You're a considerably more useful worker than you were when you were 16. You've mastered all these techniques. They want you back. You're trained now. They're going to get much better value for money out of you as a trained woman. Of course, they want you back. It's all about skill, I think.
So systems have been put in place by the employers to help these married women back into work, but what sort of systems were in place at home to help care for the children and the house, the sort of priorities that women were meant to have?
Exactly. Childcare was clearly just as much of an issue in the 19th century as it is in the 21st century. And to start with, we have to say just how useful school is for that. Whatever else you think about school, whether children learn anything or not, the sheer business of having them being looked after for those many hours in the day frees you up for more productive paid work than you could possibly take if you were also having to mind the children. And that seems to have been very important. This area has a stupendously good record of education. I really, really noticed it in the records. Particularly early. 1850s, education was not compulsory and it was not free.
No.
And yet, round here, almost every child under 11 was in school.
That's really odd.
It's quite a thing. It is really something special about this area. Education was important to the people who lived here, and I think part of the reason for that is because work for married women was important around here. Schooling just gave you that bit more flexibility. And it must be said that early 19th century school teachers knew that and would often take on very young children when they knew a family needed the mother to go back to work. You find, usually in records that are from rural schools, to be fair, but I think you find it sort of scattered around everywhere, little comments here and there that suggest that the primary school teachers were willing to take on 2-year-olds.
Wow.
And it's for poor families. They wouldn't do it for a richer family, but they would take, if a family was poor and needed a mum to go out to work, they'd take on a 2-year-old, a toddler. It must have made a huge difference.
So married women seems to be a really big trend in working patterns for women in this area. But another big, trend we see is migration. So this area, we had a lot of people migrating from Wales or nearby counties such as Cheshire, Staffordshire, Worcestershire. Did that affect how women worked in any way and their working patterns?
It's difficult to say for certain, but there are the occasional little hint. One thing, for example, is the very large number of young Welsh women married to local families, like married in as wives to local men. And what I think that hints at is that there was a liking locally for Welsh maidservants, that there was a real preference for a Welsh girl to work in your home. And of course that drew a lot of single Welsh women across the border. And once they're here, then they find a partner, they settle down and they stay. So that's one little pattern that you can sort of guess at. Another thing that is very clear is that those who are newly arrived are obviously, like all migrants, you know, like they need every bit of help they can get, so they tend to club together. You know, they go and find somebody else that, you know, who's from a similar area. Maybe they even have a relative in common, and they tend to sort of, you get little pockets of people. And so if you've got a new migrant coming in and they're single, they'll often lodge with a family that also made that trip not that long before. So you see little pockets, well, that makes sense, doesn't it? And these people who are newly arrived are often at the very base level of the workforce. They're doing the worst jobs. And again, that's a pattern you would expect with migrants, and the same is true of women. Women who are arriving, and you know, obviously you can see from the censuses how long, where they've been, tend to be in labouring jobs. They're doing the lifting and the shifting. It's the sort of job you can get when you haven't got any connections locally, when, you know, you've got no skill particularly based in anything. You're, you know, they're poorly paid, but it is work. So we do see a lot of women arriving to do very manual, labouring, non-skilled work. There is a quite interesting little blip of Irish migration that turns up in Broseley in the 1850s, and again you know, you've got the list of all the people in the household, and you've got the list of where they're all born, and quite a significant number of these households in 1850s are all born in County Mayo or County Sligo, with the exception of a baby of a couple of months old who's born locally. So, you know, these are really recent migrants. They're clearly very poor. You get a huge number of people crammed into a house, even if it's a smallish family. So there's one family I found, there were 5 of them all coming in from Ireland, but they're sharing the house with another family of 7, all also from Ireland. They're packed into what I presume was a little 2 up, 2 down. You know, a family of 5 and a family of 7, both crammed into the same house. And the people who've got work within those 2 families are almost all labouring. They are all labouring. They're just doing, you know, entry-level work. And also, quite interestingly, it seems as if, I just get the impression that it might have been a bit easier for the young women of those families to get work than it was for the adult men or the boys. I'm not sure why, and that might only be, I just, you know, there's not quite enough information to be sure, but I just got a feeling that maybe it was the girls who managed to sort of like put the first couple of loaves of bread on the table before the family got established.
That's really, really interesting. So we've got a lot of women working in manual jobs, in labouring. Were the women starting to move into the office jobs in these factories as well? Because obviously that's another side to industrial workers. It's not all hands-on, some of it is behind the scenes. So are we seeing any women kind of move into this area?
Right at the very, very end of the 19th century. We really are talking 1890, 1900, and the numbers are very small. But before that, there's nothing. Absolutely nothing. This is a whole new world of work that is just beginning to open up to women. Throughout the rest of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, office work had been a male-only workplace. Completely, totally male-only. And then right at the end of this 19th century, we start to see a little teeny touch of female involvement. And what's quite interesting to my mind is that those women, this little handful of women, are really dominated by women who are not local. Decidedly not local. They are from other areas of the nation. We get somebody from Manchester, we get a couple from London, and they are arriving as adult young women. They're not coming with their families, they're coming alone.
Very independent.
Very independent, and they are coming as skilled workers, trained workers, who are for the first time being allowed into an office. And I think the fact that they are outsiders coming in is part of that accepting process. You know, it would have been, I think, quite difficult for people locally to have accepted a woman, a local woman, into the office, you know?
Getting above herself. Yeah.
Whereas getting a girl from London who's had some professional training, it's a girl, but she is a professional trained girl from London, you know. She's special.
Very metropolitan.
Very special. The usual rules don't apply. Special. And therefore they're willing to sort of make a little space for her. I mean, two quite rather, I particularly liked when I first came across, I'm reading down the censuses and reading down all the occupations, and there it said, lady typist. Ooh! There were two of them, two lady typists. And when I sort of tried to trace them around, they were both London born, in different areas of London, but quite close together. And I suspect that they trained at the same typing school. I think that they were deliberately, you know, the company was looking deliberately for some typists. Typing was new. You know, this is a new technology. We've got a new technology. We want to be modern. We want a modern office. Technology, where do we get some trained typists? So they've probably contacted a school of typing. And these two young women have come up from London together, up to here, and then they lodge together up here. They're put into the house of an established office worker of enormous and impeccable respectability.
Very important.
Very important. So they stay as lodgers with this very respectable, very established, very trusted pre-existing office worker. And they go into the office to do the typing. It is the start of a whole new world, and it brings with it new attitudes in many directions. Those two lady typists are the first, and they're followed in the next 10 years by another couple of trained lady typists from outside the area into a different company. It obviously caught on quite quick. But in all of these cases, they do not go on to become married women workers. Our first new lady office workers, women office workers, all leave work when they get married.
So this seems very class-based. So you've got lots of working class women. They're allowed to continue working, but a slightly higher ranking office worker, a bit more middle class, a bit more respectable. The second they get married, you're out. It's very, the differences between the two and the expectations of the two, the very stark class differences.
I think that's quite interesting too. Office work, it seems, follows a similar pattern to school teaching. If you look at school teaching throughout the Gorge, in the early periods, there are a few married school teachers, but over time, that gets shut down. We won't take women anymore. And as schooling and teaching becomes more formal, more of a profession with qualifications and rules and institutions, we get a marriage bar, a complete, absolute bar. No married woman will be employed. So a teacher who could spend years training, years practicing, loads of education, the moment she got married, she lost her job. She couldn't go back after she'd had children. She couldn't even go back as a widow. That was it. Got married, job's gone. And that same idea seems to have gone immediately with the office workers, that they too are facing a marriage bar. Yes, this is a new world of work, but only when you're single, love.
So we've discussed some of the trends that you found with women and working patterns, but I know you've also looked into some individuals as well. So were there any in particular that really stood out to you?
There are so many. I almost don't know where to start really. I'm particularly taken with a group of young women who turn up in the newspapers in the 1860s. All similar sorts of situations, but one that really caught my eye was a young lady called Anne Evans. So 1860, and she's in court. She's being prosecuted for an assault upon a sickly-looking lad. She is described as a swarthy-looking pit girl, and she has lamped him one. It would turn out, according to her testimony, that he's turned up at the pit bank where she's working. So she's on the pit bank outside the mine, picking stones, moving, loading, that sort of thing going on, probably as part of a gang of young women.
Yeah.
And he turns up, and she says he has no business being there. And although he looks young, he is in fact 18, and he has been paying his dresses to one of the women. So he's clearly, he's
Stepping out of line.
He's clearly bothering one of the girls, and she's lamped him one. She gets fined, unfortunately, 10 shillings for thumping him one, but, you know, hey. I like to hear that a girl's got a bit of oomph to her. The only other thing I could find out about her was the next year, in 1861, she does turn up in the census, and she's living with her parents. Her father was a clerk at the coal wharf, but by 1861, she is no longer working on the pit bank. Perhaps the incident didn't go down terribly well, and promoted a change of direction, because she's now working in one of the roofing tile manufacturers instead.
Oh, at least she's still working.
She's still working. But I mean, the range of women's lives that one can track is quite astounding. Some of them you can only see a little snapshot, like Anne Evans, which we've really only got that little 2-year window into her life. But some of them you can see over a very long period. So Maria, for example, turns up first in 1841. She's already married, and she's already got 6 kids. So, you know, 1840. And we can continue to see her in the records until the age of 82.
Oh, that's really nice.
It is nice, isn't it? And every decade you can see her. And she's basically goes straight back to the china works. She's a china burnisher. And that's where, as a married woman with 6 kids already, she goes back to work. She carries on having kids for a couple more years. Then she takes in a granddaughter. So there's this huge, great family at home. And there she is, solidly china burnisher, right through the decades. And her children too mostly end up in the china works in one capacity or other, both boys and girls. And we finally see her aged 82 as a widow, living with one of her younger sons, James, and 2 further children, 2 step-grandchildren. And then, of course, at the other end with scale, we find somebody who's much more independently in charge of their own life. This is quite an early story, Mary Clemson. Now, we only get to notice her at the moment of her decease, of her death. And that's in the 1750s, so this is mid-18th century. She was already a widow, but she had adult children. And in her will, which is the only piece of information we have about her, just this one document, she leaves her rope-making business to her married daughter.
Oh, that's very interesting.
It's really unusual, isn't it? She's clearly been running that rope-making business in her own right as a widow. She leaves the tools, she leaves the space in which it's done, all to her married daughter, if her married daughter wishes to carry on the business. She's got adult sons, and obviously her daughter has got a husband, but she doesn't give it to the men. She gives it to her married daughter, an active business that I suspect they've both been doing together, independently of their male family members.
So, out of everything that you've researched, everything you've found, what did you find the most interesting?
Oh, that's really difficult, actually. I found the whole process fascinating. I loved it, I'll be honest. I loved it. Interesting. Oh, I think it was finding how much married women were being used within the china industries. I think that was sort of not something I'd really come across, that idea of career progression and a long life within an industry, of working as a young woman, coming back as a married woman, working all the way through if you wanted to, that the amount of choices that there might have been for such a woman, where she, particularly those in the later period, had the option of moving across to the tile works and back. I think I found that sort of interplay of people making choices in their lives, navigating their lives. I think perhaps that was the most interesting thing.
It's almost a lot of parallels to today, how women have that choice in their career path these days.
I think so. I think it speaks very directly to us as modern women, you and I. I mean, one has to sort of balance. I mean, it happens to men too. Let's not be unfair about this. Being human is about balancing many different aspects of your life, balancing your responsibilities to partners, to children, to parents, to other family members, and also to your workplace and your own feelings about what you want out of your life. It's never been straightforward for any of us. And seeing that detail being played out in the past it just reminds you of the connection, doesn't it?
Very relatable.
Very relatable.
Yeah. And so as a final question, out of everything you've discovered, what surprised you the most?
Oh, it has to be the level of education that I was seeing in the records. Compulsory education and free education only came into Britain in the 1880s and then the 1890s. But in the Gorge, by 1851, pretty much every kid under the age of 11 was in school. I mean, that's
odd.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
You know, that's really not the national trend. That's all those people, even very poor people, were paying money to send their children to school, not sending them out to work. That really surprised me. And this tradition of education that seems to have been within this area was very, very strong. When I started looking, I found school mistresses going back into the late 17th century.
Wow.
Which, you know, again, was a surprise. And then moving forward, in 1901, I'm busily going through the census, and I find not one, but 2 female university students.
That's so unusual.
Isn't it? 1901, 2 of them, Edith Shingler and Annie Stevenson, I think, both attending university in 1901. I was just blown away. This is an area that really took education seriously, and yet another indication is the number of girls' boarding schools that I kept finding. I mean, often they're very, very small, and obviously only the wealthier members of the community could afford to send their girls to a boarding school, but they're there. From the 1850s onwards, there are little secondary school education opportunities for some women. What a tradition.